And I became very interested in a movement that really started at the end of the 90s called positive psychology, right? And so this was when Martin Seligman, who was the president of the American Psychological Association at that time, said, gosh, you know, we now have learned a lot about diagnostic criteria for illnesses, and we've learned about interventions for illnesses, and we've learned a lot about like what anxiety looks like and what depression looks like and what obsessive compulsive disorder looks like and all these things. And so now we have become very good describers of problems and you know, sort of pathologizers. And shouldn't we be as interested in building up people's strengths as we are in looking at weaknesses? Shouldn't we care about what makes people happy? Oh, nobody had thought of studying that before until about 1998. And now we have, you know, these almost about 30 years close to a lot of research on, you know, what is awe and what is joy and what is happiness. First of all, let's just talk about this connection, so mind-body connection. So let's just start with this question of stress. All right, here's what I always do when the first time I present something. I decide in the moment that I wish I would have had a different flow. So I wish I would have this slide first. So this slide, so what's the definition of stress? Definition of stress is a physiological response, body, right, in your body, a physiological response to a perceived threat, doesn't even need to be real, mind, right, and the belief that somehow you don't have what you need to manage the threat, right, mind. Right there, the very definition of stress shows that there is a mind-body connection, right? Because stress, everybody thinks, you know, it's just stress, which, ooh, you want to get me going, just say that, because, right, stress literally can kill people, right? So it's never just stress. But people think, oh, stress just means it's in my head. Not true. Right? What happens to you? How do you know when you're stressed? Sleep is one of the first things that goes for a lot of people. Yes. Sleep.
Short temper.
Oh, irritability. Yes. Yeah, that's when other people point it out to you, right? Like, oh, what's up with you? Yeah. Yeah.
Ruminating, just like so many thoughts, right?
Yeah. Yeah, intrusive thoughts, yeah. You know, I had the thought, but I felt it right here, right? That, like, you know, when you get a piece of bad news and you say, that was a gut punch, right? Or, you know, kids can relate to this, you know, they have speech class and they have to go throw up first, right? You know, or maybe that happens to you. So we don't have to think too hard to get this idea that stress, that there's a connection between our mind and our body. Also, I just want to say, there, you know, again, on the positive end, how an example of the mind-body connection is athletes who will, have you ever seen, who watches ice skating besides me? Okay, yeah. You know, you see them in the back, just doing this on the ground, right? They are practicing the revolutions in their head, right? They are visualizing. Gymnasts do it too, right? They visualize themselves completing, doing well at it, right? That is a perfect example of the mind-body connection also. I do want to talk for just a minute about the placebo effect also. So this is a classic example of the mind-body connection, right? So the placebo effect is, right, when we believe that something is going to be helpful, it 35% of the time will be helpful, right? So if we take a medicine, and our doctors say help, this is gonna be, you know, the silver bullet for you, and you believe, you know, in the wisdom of your doctor, you believe in the magic of the pill, you know, 35% of the time you will feel better, even if it's a sugar pill. Even if there's no medicine involved in there, right? And the placebo kinds of studies are really fascinating. You know, like literally people will have a rash, and then they'll give somebody a sugar pill and say, this is going to clear up your rash. If they believe it, it clears up the rash. There's nothing there other than their belief. There's nothing, there's no chemical that actually would have impacted that. And so when you see something like that, that's so obvious. So placebo, and by the way, you know, to get a drug approved through the FDA, it has to be more effective than placebo, right? So in other words, it has to show that it impacts at least more than at least 35% of people. Because 35% of people are gonna, well, between 30 and 35 are gonna get better, you know, if they think they are, even if it's nothing. So in order to get it approved, to say like, yeah, this has a good chance of being helpful, it's gotta be more than placebo. But did y'all know that there's a thing called the nocebo effect? And guess what the nocebo effect is? If you believe something's not gonna work, it doesn't work. 35% of the time, right? You're like, well, I'll do this, that probably isn't gonna work. Like that is the power of the mind. And that is a fantastic example of the mind-body connection. So yeah, the nocebo effect just again kind of shows the power of, and can we exactly explain placebo or nocebo? Someday I can't, you know, I'm not a biochemist or a neuroscientist, but whatever. Anyways, so now let's talk about how we can use our body to change how we feel emotionally, right? So one way is, you know, to just, if I were to ask all of you to hold a fist, and to hold a fist for about 5 minutes, you would start to feel angry, right? One of the things, so we know there's a big correlation between posture and feelings, right? So we know if you were to look at like Google images of people who feel crappy, you're gonna see a lot of this. You're gonna see a lot of contraction, a lot of head down, and a lot of covering, right? We contract, we make ourselves small. And if you were to look at, you know, show me an image of somebody feeling well, somebody feeling good, somebody feeling great, it's this. It's expansion. Now you want to hear something really crazy? There's a great TED Talk on this by Amy Cuddy is her name, who has done a lot of work on posture and power. Interesting stuff. Okay, so, you know, this is what happens. Doesn't matter what language you speak. You know, watch the Olympics and people who cross the finish line, this is what they do. You know, when you're somewhere and your team, you know, scores a touchdown or scores a basket, we turn to strangers and high five, right? We expand, right? How about this little piece that Amy Cuddy tells us, that there was, this is just bizarre to me, there was a study of blind runners. So in people who were blind from birth, who run, well, that in itself is a little mind-blowing to me, but actually that anybody runs, but whatever, okay. Right, that's one of my favorite jokes, you know, I don't run with scissors. I didn't need the with scissors part, you know, just, right, okay. So blind runners, they cross the finish line and the blind runners do this as they cross. In other words, they've never seen anyone else do it, but that is like a natural reaction when you feel good, is to be more expansive, right? Okay, so this really comes into play as a clinician, as a mental health clinician. There definitely is is a posture of depression, right? And so one of the things that we may tell people, right, even in the room, like right now, okay, and you all can do this, you know, slouch a little bit for a second, right? And then if I were to say to you, lengthen your spine. Do you feel different? Yeah. Yeah, just like in a second, right? Now, this, you know, doesn't solve your problems of the world, but what it is an example of how, like, the way that we hold ourselves actually changes how we feel. The grin and bear it is about, like, there really is something to that, which there is this, like, research that smiling, even if you don't feel like it, actually changes how you feel. Yeah. Smiling can change how you feel. You know, lengthening your spine, holding yourself somewhere different. So let's just do this for a minute. I'll just ask everyone to stand up if you are willing and able. And we're just going to, anyone here do yoga? Like nobody wants to admit it? Okay. All right, we're just gonna do a mountain pose, okay? So this is just like getting in touch. So your feet are hip distance apart, your toes are pointing forward, your ankles are like right under your hips, okay? And then you navel to the spine, right? Okay, navel to the spine. So you just kind of like create some tension in your core. And then I tell people, you know, you can like squeeze your butt cheeks too, you know, so you're creating some strength in your legs. Here we go. And then palms out here, right? Now you want to make sure that your chin is level to the ground and back just a little bit. So they tell you just actually take 2 fingers here and just push back a little bit so there's no curve in your neck. So see if you can just hold this for a second. This is just mountain pose. And take a deep breath. And you want to make sure that your exhalation is at least as long as your inhalation. But maintain that same posture and just inhale again and exhale slowly. And go ahead and have a seat. Now, what do you notice as you just hold yourself in this way where you're actually just creating some strength in your body? What do you notice? Oh, I'm aware. Right? I'm aware of my body. Oh, I wasn't even thinking about my core, you know, right? Here I am. And, you know, I'm not going to deep dive into all of this, but we can change this. I was on a leadership team and we had to do warrior pose, right? You know, right? Why? Because, you know, you do this and you can feel stronger. Oh, please don't take a photo.
Oh, man. I'm capturing the essence.
Busted, right?
It's
warrior
great.
pose right here. Yeah. Anyways, why? You know, that is the pose of warrior. But do we actually feel like a warrior when we take on warrior pose? Yeah, we can if we stay present and do it. So it's a little example of how we can use our body to change the way that we feel emotionally or in our heads. So obviously, you know, other ways to use the body to change how we feel: sleep. Sleep is, when I would do consults on the OB floor, you know, I would remind people that sleep deprivation is a form of torture, right? It is. It is what we do to prisoners of war to break them down. We want people to feel desperate and emotional and broken. You just deprive them of sleep. Yeah. So we absolutely know that, you know, and I would tell people also, you know, the symptoms of sleep deprivation are the same symptoms of depression, right? You're more irritable, your emotions are, you know, just under the surface, you don't have energy, you know, have a low mood. It's all, you know, it all looks the same, sleep deprivation and that. So getting sleep, I know lots of people struggle with sleep, and I will tell you also as a therapist, it's been very interesting since the legalization of cannabis, because it seems as though everybody uses a gummy now and then to fall asleep. I'm not saying do it or don't do it, I'm just saying that pretty much though, people who, because you know, they have to write it on their intake form, you know, what your meds are, and pretty much people will say for sleep. You know, people getting to that point, you know, of I need something. It's not a program on how to get more sleep. Talk to somebody about figuring out things that you need to do to get sleep. I can talk to you about it, but that's not what we're here for. Exercise, and you'll see this more once we get to the talking about hormones, is exercise is one of the fastest ways to use our body to change how we feel emotionally or how we think, right? Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be like massive cardio stuff, but moving your body changes how we feel, period, right? You know, just walking, you know, clears my head, but you know, whatever, we know, I think some people have heard, you know, sitting is the new smoking. Have you heard this? Right? Sitting is the new smoking, meaning that leading too much of a sedentary life will take actually years off your life, the way that we used to talk about nicotine. And you want to talk about the influence of scrolling, right? That is primarily a sit down, lay down, which, you know the one of the words of 2024, I think, 2024, one of the words that they entered into the dictionary was couch rot. Have you heard this? Couch rotting or bed rotting. So, and what that is really has to do with social media. It has to do with sitting somewhere and just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and not really doing anything else. You know, doom scrolling, we call that also, right? So, yeah, so if you want to actually change how you feel, yeah, you gotta do something. Sorry, I was just thinking about a client, and it's like, you know, why do you think you're gonna feel better when you come home from work and lay in your bed and, you know, scroll on TikTok for 4 hours? You know, well, that's nothing. No, that is nothing. That's nothing. And obviously, nutrition. And I will talk, once we get into like the specific hormones, I'll talk a little bit about certain foods. I'm not a dietitian, I got my own problems. But they're, you know, basically the reality is honestly, whatever is good for your heart is good for your brain. You know, as far as like fiber and protein and fatty, like those kinds of things. But there are specific things that can help with some of the feel-good hormones, which we can talk about. So I kind of did this already. I talked about the evolution of my interest, right? When I first started really looking at the correlation between mental health and physical health, with some very specific things like cardiovascular disease and diabetes in particular. Mostly because those are very, very common. They are the things that bring people into the healthcare system, and there's a ton of research. So I'm gonna talk also for a minute here, a little bit, just to that nod to, column A, and talk a little bit about trauma and what trauma does to our bodies. So this is probably the most famous book written about traumatic experiences. It's called The Body Keeps the Score, written by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And it's chock full of research on how traumatic events are stored in our bodies. So just a little bit on a little bit about this. I'm trying to stay focused here. But what happens when we're exposed to traumatic events, our brains sometimes try to make sense of it, and sometimes you can't make sense of being sexually abused by a parent or an uncle or something, by some awful event that has happened to you, when the people who are trusted to take care of you hurt you. So your brain has to do kind of gymnastics to forget about or minimize or rationalize or justify those behaviors. But what we know is that, it remains in our body, and it remains in the amygdala, the part of our brain where fear is stored, right? So unresolved trauma often manifests as physical pain, somatic symptoms, right? I don't feel good. And this is some of the stuff that you guys talked about, right? Hypervigilance, always looking over your shoulder, a very pronounced startle response. Somebody comes up behind you and you jump 4 feet in the air. The re-experiencing of trauma, that is flashbacks, right? Or, every, I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I was just thinking about, I had a really terrible boss one time, and anytime I saw a brown Mitsubishi, my stomach hurt, that's the re-experiencing of the trauma. Anytime I saw a car that looked like her car, I got that kicked in the gut kind of feeling, right? That's the re-experiencing. One time after she got fired, and I met with her, and I told her that I had a stomachache every single day on the way to work. You know what this terrible boss said to me? No, you didn't.
It's how your fault.
I had a stomachache every day on the way to work. No, you didn't. Okay, I gotta go now. Anyways, emotional numbness, dissociation, right? And then obviously we know that with people who've experienced trauma then have attachment, relationship, trust issues. They don't know how to set boundaries. Either they don't want anyone near them, or they love everybody because they're just trying to hold on to somebody who will love them back, right? So, okay, I'm gonna do this very briefly. I could talk for 3 hours on the ACE study, but I'm not. I'm just gonna do this very briefly. But this is where a lot of our information about trauma in the body comes from, and trauma and medical illnesses. So yeah, I won't give you the history. Here's your ACE score. So there's 10 questions. The questions are, trigger warning. They're hard to read for some people, but I'll give you a moment. Kind of get the picture, okay? Were your parents ever divorced or separated? Was your mother or grandmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes, often, or very often, kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit at least a few minutes, or threatened with a gun or a knife? Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? Was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Did a household member go to prison? Okay, those are the 10 questions. Every time you answered yes to one of those questions, you have a score of 1. Okay? Now, remember that most of these things, some of these things were this ever happened, and some were, did it often or very often. Okay, so these slides come right from the study, 2003, Vincent Folletti. Okay, here's what we know. 50% of people, now the CDC owns all this research. It started with Folletti, but now the CDC, 50% of people scored 1. Well, if you know anything about anything, you know, well, of course, because one of the questions is, were your parents divorced? And 50% of people have divorced parents, right? So right there, it's not surprising that 50% had a score of 1. But they were surprised that 25% scored 2, and 6% of people in the population had a score of 4 or more. Okay, you want to see the connection between exposure to childhood trauma and your physical health? Here we go. Now, some of these are health behaviors, but you will see a whole bunch of things that there is a stair-step correlation between your exposure to trauma as a child and the likelihood that you will have some risky health behaviors and then health diseases. So this is how likely you are to smoke. Then I'll show you how likely you are to have COPD, right? To have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So look at that. Here's alcoholism, right? Here's your likelihood of IV drug use. And as somebody who works also in substance use, because I do some contract work in a substance abuse treatment facility, we see this all the time, the adverse childhood experiences. So because they drink and they smoke, guess what? They're much more likely to have hepatitis or jaundice or some other sort of liver disease. They're much more likely to have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. They're much more likely to die early, right? Clearly, one of the things that we have learned from the adverse childhood experience study is that we absolutely know that exposure to stress is linked to a weakening of the immune system and an increase in inflammatory response. Now, this is just adverse childhood experiences. There's a lot of crappy things that happen to people that happen after the age of 18, people that are traumatic experiences, right? And there's things that were not on the ACE study, like bullying was not on the ACE study. Exposure to neighborhood violence, right? It's only violence in your home is what they were looking at, but if you live in a neighborhood where your neighbors are getting shot at, that's an exposure, or wartime zones. And again, there was a difference because some, like the sexual abuse, were you ever sexually abused? You get a score of 1 whether it happened 4 times a week from the time you were 6 to the time you were 16, or if it happened one time when dad or grandpa came home drunk. It's a score of 1. So obviously there's lots of differences, but we see this. So we absolutely know that stress from childhood, but then also we know like people who survive natural disasters. We all know the mental health of the people in New Orleans after Katrina was awful. Of course it was, because their lives changed in an instant, right? Where they worked and where they went to school and where they went to the bank and where they stopped for their coffee in the morning and the people that they saw in the grocery store and the church that they went to, everything changed in a moment. So, of course. Okay, so that is a very brief look at how trauma impacts the body, right? Just some things about what depression looks like in our body. We know depression, increase in blood pressure, elevated cortisol. So cortisol is the stress hormone. It's one of the stress hormones, right? It's a catecholamine. It is a stress hormone. So when you have too much cortisol in your system, guess what? It elevates your insulin, it elevates your cortisol. This is one of the reasons why we see that the diabetes and depression. And the relationship between diabetes and depression is bidirectional, which is very odd, right? Normally it's like, if you have this, you're more likely to have that, period, right? But with depression and diabetes, it goes both ways. If you are diabetic, you are more likely to develop depression. And if you have a history of depression, you are more likely to develop diabetes. So there is some correlation here. We believe it has something to do with this elevated cortisol, the stress hormone that your brain says dump into your system, right? That then creates elevated insulin and cholesterol, which then creates disease, right? When you have increased stress hormones, then you have less immunoprotective things happening, right? So the things that protect your immune system, and then your immune system suffers, right? When people are depressed, this is still from my hospital days, right? So when people were depressed, they're less likely to take care of their diabetes or their heart disease. So they wouldn't actually do what the doctors were saying, but they would keep showing up in the doctor's offices, right? Yeah, and this is, excuse the expression, the bitch about depression, which is the very things that will make you feel better are the things you don't feel like doing. Like getting out of bed, moving your body, eating something healthy, calling a friend, any of those things you don't feel like doing when you're depressed, but that's exactly what you need to do to feel better. So, yeah, people with depression have higher rates of CHF, congestive heart failure, wow, my brain, congestive heart failure, and greater incidence of diabetes, depression. Okay, so you guys are getting it. I'm going to move on. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this though, because I think it's really interesting. So, people have heard of the type A personality? Okay, so yes, it has been proven to be nothing. But there are a couple of interesting things. So how did this whole thing start? Well, it started with these two cardiologists, like Friedman and Rosenberg, and they were going to reupholster the chairs in their cardiology waiting room. And what they noticed was that the chairs were actually, the upholstery was actually only worn right here, right at the very edge of the chair. So then they said, what is it about the people who come to a cardiologist's office that literally sit at the edge of the seat, right? So then they started looking at personality characteristics, and they started talking about this type A personality, and they said if you had this type A personality, you are much more likely to have heart disease, right? So what were type A personality people like? They, very highly competitive, measured everything in terms of numbers, very driven, very, did things fast, kind of this very intense kind of thing, right? And they said, oh, if you had a type A personality, you were more likely to have heart disease. Well, that turned out to not be true, but they did find one personality characteristic that actually mattered with all of those type A personality, with those type A people, and what they found was that if they had all those things, and they actually had a personality characteristic of hostility, then they were more likely to have heart disease. Yeah. So again, mind-body connection, mind-body connection, mind-body connection. So what is hostility? Hostility is an interplay of thoughts, angry thoughts, which is cynicism, right? Oh, he's probably just ordering this test because he makes money from it. Oh, they're probably out to screw you over. They don't really care about you. They're just lying to you. Yeah, don't believe everything you read, you know, all of that. That's an angry thought. That's cynicism. Anger is the emotion, right, of hostility, and then the action is when there's aggression, right? So folks who were high in hostility, those were the ones that were more likely to develop some cardiovascular problems. So why would that be? Well, they were always on the edge of their seat, so they were hyper-vigilant, they were waiting for something bad to happen, so their fight or flight response was triggered all the time, right? Danger, 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 someone's out to hurt me, I gotta be ready, you know. So when you set off that fight or flight, your heart, right, it increases your blood pressure, it increases your heart rate, it increases your respiration, and then all of a sudden, guess what? Your heart's working too hard, right? It doesn't need to work that hard. You don't need to be in fight or flight that often, right? But you are, and so then, you know, then you raise your blood sugar, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so, yeah. So people who had hostility and heart disease had increased mortality from all causes. So, all right, oops, that goes. One more thing I'm going to say about hostility, you know, you know, I end with some stuff about laughter and humor and, you know, kind of the benefits of that. But, you know, we're attracted to people that make us laugh. And, you know, when I ask people, even clients, even 14-year-old clients, you know, what is the most isolating emotion? When do you, if you want people to leave you alone, how, you know, what emotion do you show? And they all know it's anger, right? Anger is an isolating emotion. And we had this guy in the treatment facility, and he was kind of, until you got to know him, he was a bit of an intimidating dude. He had spent like 6 years in prison. And we were talking about it one day in group therapy, and he goes, even angry people don't want to be around angry people. Oh, Tony. But yeah, so when there's a cost also to hostility, and that is, you know, people don't want to be around you. You have fewer friends. Of course you do, because you don't trust anybody. You push people away. You're not that fun to be around, you know. So they have fewer friends, less social support. They have more subjective feelings of stress, and then oftentimes, you know, they go to drugs, alcohol, nicotine, all those things to try to medicate themselves. All right. So, got it? Connection between mind and body. It is there when the bad stuff, right? It doesn't matter if you're starting with something in the body, but when the mind is exposed to trauma or negative emotions or poor mental health, it does have an impact on your physical system. So let's talk about, now I'm turning right. Okay, now we're going to go to the feel-good stuff and how. So there's more than this, but these are the kind of the top 4 of the feel-good hormones. So these are the things that we want to create more of in our system because it will help our bodies feel better. So dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphins. Okay. So dopamine is the chemical of reward, right? So dopamine makes us want to go out and seek out and get the dopamine hits. Now, social media. You know what creates a dopamine hit? An Instagram like, or a TikTok like, or whatever, right? Yeah, that is a dopamine hit for people who are content creators or posters or whatever, care about it, and they will, you know, post and then, you know, look and look and look and look and look and look and count, you know, their hits and all that. So what we know is that dopamine increases our sense of arousal. We feel more alive when we get a dopamine hit, right? Dopamine makes you curious about ideas, fuels your search for information, right? We feel very alive, we feel very interested. Here's the thing that's really important is that dopamine creates this, it is self-reinforcing, right? So what I mean by that is it has to do with the reward center of your brain. So you do something and it feels good, and then you know what your brain says? More please, more please, right? And this is whether, you know, you're eating a potato chip, you know, or you're doing a line of cocaine. That's the problem, right? But there is a very interesting book out. It's called Dopamine, the Molecule of More, right? And so this happens whenever we have anything that's sort of pleasurable, is, you know, the dopamine says, keep going, right? Okay, so there is some interesting stuff out there that says that, which kind of makes some sense to me, that says that extroverted people actually produce more dopamine than introverted people, which does kind of make sense to me because, you know, dopamine, you're sort of looking for novel experiences. You probably take more reasonable risks, you know, because you want to feel alive, right? You know, dopamine and adrenaline very often go together, you know. So it makes sense to me that introverted people may have to work a little bit harder to get the dopamine hits, or maybe they have to find something else that creates that sense. But, you know, I worked with a woman who got involved with a married man, and she talked all the time about the dopamine hit of whenever he would text, you know, sort of the sense, you know, that she, like, made her feel alive, you know. This is, by the way, you know, she was 63 or 64 years old at the time I'm not talking about a young person. Again, I'm not going to explain the neuroscience behind this of, you know, dopamine and L-dopa and levodopa, but people with Parkinson's disease have very low dopamine. Also, interestingly enough, you know, the other disease that low dopamine shows up in, restless leg syndrome. It's kind of interesting. So like a movement disorder. So that shows up. We also know that people who are have a very low mood, or, you know, have a lot of sadness or depression, tend to be low in dopamine. So we want to get them, and this is the challenge because they don't feel like it. It's like, but you need this, right? You know, we want to get some dopamine going. So, you know, go on a roller coaster, or, you know, have some delicious food, or do some activity that brings you pleasure, right? It sounds so simple, right? But it's, you know, simple but not easy, as we say, right? Simple but not easy. There is some nutritional stuff here that your dopamine can be boosted by foods that are high in tyrosine. So this has to do with an amino acid that, like, connects to the dopamine or pushes the dopamine, or something. Again, not a neuroscientist, but that's what that is. And again, you'll see, you know, it's not, you know, Fruit Loops, right? It's never going to be Fruit Loops on there is like the thing that's going to make you feel better.
Old temporarily.
What?
I said old temporarily.
Oh, you know, yeah, that gets into like a whole other issue when we start talking about, like, do things that make you feel good, and then people go like, a whole cheesecake, you know, right? So then which, you know, my response is, and I'm a little bit off, but my response is, if you are enjoying the whole cheesecake, then enjoy the whole cheesecake. But most of the time, you enjoy the first 1, 2, 3, 5 bites, and then you're not feeling better, you're feeling nothing. Then you're eating to numb, not to actually feel good. And that goes with wine, and that goes with pornography, and that goes with gambling. It goes with lots of those, what we call process addictions. Also, you know, in the positive psychology stuff, I mean, one of the skills that we teach people is savoring. You know, sort of this idea of like, you're gonna take a bite of that, you know, and, you know, and one of my friends who's a dietitian and worked in weight management, I mean, she would say, you know, tell me, cheesecake is your favorite thing? And then she would say, take 30 minutes to eat that piece of cheesecake. You probably won't finish it. You probably won't. So, you know, again, I think there gets to be this, I mean, there's also like, you know, again, the dopamine goes, so more, right? More, which is, you know, when addiction comes in. But if you can savor, you know, alcoholics drink fast, and drug addicts use without thinking. They pick up without thinking. I don't like how I feel right now. If I do this, I'm going to feel different immediately, and that's good, because I just want to feel different, right? I don't want to feel this. Yeah, I think for a lot of things, you know, understanding the concept of savoring, understanding the concept of slowing down, understanding the concept of mindfulness, that is what is going to prevent the, because at some point, you know, if you eat fast, you don't, I mean, this is basic stuff, you know, it takes 20 minutes to feel full, right? So, you know, if you eat fast, then all of a sudden it's 20 minutes later and then you feel sick. But if you eat slowly, you know, you will enjoy it more, and you will give your body a chance to catch up and feel full. Anyway, so dopamine has a role in fight or flight, and so then all these things happen, right? So it has an impact on our blood vessels. Can increase sodium, reduces insulin production in your pancreas, kind of slows down the GI stuff, right? Okay, so dopamine, what do I want to say? This is the stuff that makes you motivated. You want to do something by dopamine, right? So whatever it is that where you go like, oh, I really like this, you know? It's like when the little kid goes, again, again, more, right? Okay, that's dopamine, right? Like, oh, I love that, I want to do more of that. So we want to get people, in order to feel good, we want to get them to focus on things that make them feel productive, because that feels good. Right? And we're going to talk about goals in a little bit too. That feels good. We also know that dopamine helps with perceived pain. So it sort of makes sense. Like, you can't feel two things exactly at the same time. So we sort of increase the feel good, increase the pleasure, you know, the pain is going to decrease. You know, yeah. Some of the stuff that, also done a lot of research on humor and how we feel, and another great book, Anatomy of an Illness, old book out there, Norman Cousins. You know, is that, what is it? Am I saying it right? Is that Norman Cousins? I think so. Anatomy of an Illness. He had ankylosing spondylitis, very painful arthritic condition. He noticed that when he was in a bad mood, his pain was very high. He wanted to know if, well then, if I'm in a good mood, could my pain be lower just by changing my mood? And so he did his own little experiment, and he had people bring in, again, this was many years ago, people brought in videotapes of Marx Brothers movies and episodes of Candid Camera, okay? And what he found was he could have longer periods of uninterrupted sleep after he had this exposure to laughing, right? So which is why, you know, you think of Patch Adams and, you know, clowns in hospitals and those kinds of things, that's it. So, you know, so they've done these experiments where they have people like stick their arm in a bucket of ice water while they do something to make them laugh, or while they do nothing. And of course, if they do, or if they do some neutral thing, and it, you know, they're able to keep their hands in the bucket of ice longer if they are distracted with laughter than if they're distracted with just something neutral or something negative, right? Yeah, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit here. Okay, so that's dopamine. If you, you know, to boost your dopamine, you want to set some goals and then march toward achieving your goals, because achievement is one of the 5 things that makes us feel better. That's a positive psychology thing, right? So we feel good when we do something that makes us feel productive or accomplished. Dopamine will do that. So in addition to the things that are on here, besides, it says achieving goals and celebrating wins and listening to music, meditation, also sex will be a dopamine hit, and then the stuff that can get you in trouble, like shopping or gambling or heroin or cocaine or amphetamines. But those are all things that will hit that dopamine, right? So don't do those things, but yeah, listen to music. Meditate. Okay, serotonin. Serotonin is also called the confidence molecule. So most people have heard of this, right? They've heard of SSRIs, right? They've heard of, you know, people with depression have low serotonin, and the medicines are serotonin, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, right? So people with low serotonin tend to have low mood. We want to increase serotonin. By the way, you know where 90% of your serotonin neurotransmitters are? Not in your head, in your GI tract. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yeah, in your GI tract. Yeah. Yeah, so for a lot of people, when they go off their antidepressant medication, they start to have a lot of GI distress. Yeah. And again, you want to, you know, research something else, research something called the brain-gut connection. Very powerful. But yeah, serotonin. When people have a decent amount of serotonin, then they will actually continually put themselves in a position that will enhance their sense of productivity and accomplishment, and you know, I have an opportunity to do well here or whatever. We want to get people to pursue things that connect to a sense of purpose or meaning. That's very personal, you know, right? What do you care about? What would be meaningful to you? You know, maybe it's making a birdhouse, you know, maybe it's gardening, maybe it's, you know, creating, you know, knitting blankets for your grandchildren or somebody else's grandchildren or babies in the hospitals or whatever. Do something that means something that's personally meaningful that will enhance your serotonin. Serotonin really is not really, again, not the neuroscientist, but it has to do with it, some of the things don't cross the blood-brain barrier, and so it's hard to increase serotonin through food or nutrition or supplements. But one of the best ways to increase serotonin, guess what? It's exercise. It's exercise. That is absolutely one of the best ways. And it's interesting, in the UK, where there is socialized medicine, exercise is what physicians have to first prescribe to depressed patients before the National Health Service will pay for antidepressant medication. Yeah. Now, what we know is that, like, when you're really depressed, A, you probably won't do it, and B, it's probably not going to make a big enough difference to make a difference without something else. But if if you're dragging, if you're sad, if you're lonely, if you're bored, if you're a little depressed, exercise can make a very big difference. And one of the other ones, well, we also know vitamin D. I tell all my sad people, go get a vitamin D level, especially if they also have a lot of fatigue. Get your vitamin D levels checked, and unbelievable what a difference that can make. And related to vitamin D, also sunlight. Now, back in the day, 30 years ago, we used to have like this big light machine, and people would come into the office and we'd roll it in and put them in front of it for 20 minutes. And now, you can buy things at, Bath and Body, well, I guess that's not out there. Amazon. I got mine at Bed Bath and Beyond, which I guess is still an online store. But anyways, now they make these little light things that are like this big. And I told people about this, and then COVID, right? And then I was living by myself, and it was starting to really get to me. I realized lots of things, as we all did about ourselves, And so that first winter, winter of 2020, I bought myself one of those little light things. Verilux is the name of the company that makes it, Verilux. 10,000 lumens. I could not believe the difference it made in my mood and my energy level. And since then, I've told many people to go get one, especially, for people who are depressed and people who live here 12 months out of the year, and people who tend to really notice that dip in their mood when there's less sunlight. So it's called the Happy Light. Verilux Happy Life. It's very, very bright. You put it 12 to 18 inches away from you for 20 minutes a day. You don't look directly at it, but you have it right here. So I would do it, and then I would just work on my computer, and it would be on. And I had a therapist friend who really, like me, she's a California native, she really had some seasonal affective depression, and she's like, oh, I just go as long as I can. I'll just keep that thing on for hours. But it's very, very bright, and I found that after about, I would just get lost in my work, and if I left it on for like 2 hours, I would start to get agitated because it's very bright. But anyways, a big fan of the Verilux Happy Light, and we absolutely know that sunlight is one of the ways that you can boost serotonin. Gratitude journaling. So we absolutely know for certain that when we focus on, the abundance in our life, that we find it everywhere. Once when we look for it. One time there was this guy when I was working at the hospital, and there was a guy who was in one of our outpatient programs, and he was just a great guy. He was very, very likable. He was a homeless man. One day I was walking out of the hospital, and a couple months after he had been discharged, and he was riding his bike in front of the hospital. So we see each other, and he stops, and we start talking, and I was like, hey, how you doing? And he said, I am doing great. He said, every morning there's a fox that stops by my campsite, meaning where he lives outside, and I just think, what an amazing way to start the day. And I was like, I have just been schooled in gratitude, right? And so that was in my mind for a long time. Be the fox, Shira, be the fox, you know? Be the fox, you know, the thing that can make a difference for somebody. So gratitude journaling, you know, paying attention. And, you know, this, we definitely do, this is a big part of substance abuse treatment, is to get folks to really focus on gratitude, and I'm telling you, it is a very powerful tool. So, you know, the wisdom is, you know, a few minutes at the end of the day or the beginning of the day, you take a few minutes to think about what you were grateful for, you write it down, it has to be very specific, and you never say the same thing twice. So you never say, I'm grateful for my friends, my family, and my health. No, it's like, I'm grateful that I had enough energy to walk around the block. You know, I'm grateful that my granddaughter called today and she seemed really happy to tell me something fun. I'm grateful for, you know, I had enough energy to do this, or, you know, my friend called, you know. So you get very specific about what you're grateful for, and then what happens is our lens kind of changes from a lens of scarcity to a lens of abundance. Okay. So oxytocin is the love hormone, if you will, or the bonding hormone. So oxytocin is what creates the maternal instinct, right? So oxytocin, we think that it's probably not exactly the same chemical in men as it is in women, but there is kind of like a cousin to it in men, which is that vasopressin. But what happens is oxytocin happens during childbirth. You get a surge, you know, people talk about surge of hormones, you know, and so you get a surge of oxytocin at childbirth. It actually stimulates the muscles of the uterus, so it will contract. They will give you oxytocin, you know, injection to make it happen. If it's not happening fast enough, you know, to speed up labor. But it's what kind of creates that mother-child bond. If you don't have enough oxytocin, guess what? Much more likely to have postpartum depression. So oxytocin gives us a sense of relaxation, and it enhances our feeling of being safe or being able to trust who we're with. Oxytocin does also help sort of move the whole lactation stuff along, right? It actually tells the milk to move, you know, from the breast, or from the ducts to the breast to the nipples, so that you'll be able to breastfeed. But oxytocin, so it's very, very important in childbirth, but we also can feel oxytocin when we feel in love, when we feel bonded or connected to somebody, when we have a strong social connection. How about this? Oxytocin also happens when we cuddle with animals or pet animals, right? We actually can produce oxytocin. Whenever touch, any kind of touch, was this the one that had acupuncture also? Maybe not, but massage, hugs, a cuddle. And for those of you who have kids in your life, you know, I'm just, you know, I pass along all my little bits of wisdom. You know, the rule is when a kid hugs you, you never be the first one to let go. Which, by the way, is the rule for the Disney princesses at Disneyland. It is. Yeah, they are told, that's one of the things that they're told. So as long as a kid will hold on to you, you just keep being right there. You never be the first one to let go. Because your kids always need a little bit more than what you think they do.
Kids are heartwarming them.
Well, I was talking specifically about your children. Yeah, no, I was, seriously, but that's the thing, because we oftentimes miss that cue, and, you know, they really need the oxytocin because it increases their sense of safety, right? So I was specifically talking about kids. Also, so doing acts of kindness, you know, being in a group, feeling socially connected. But here's another thing that I love, and you know, maybe some of you have this like when you go to church, but singing in a group will release oxytocin. So, you know, that can be, you know, your friends, that could be your church choir, that could be whatever, but singing in a group is one of those things where you feel that sense of, you know, we're all here doing the same thing together. I suppose you could have some oxytocin released with your bowling league or something too, but, you know, I think there has been some research about singing in a group. Okay. And then endorphins, so, you know, I explain this all the time to the people with substance use disorders that I work with. So I always look at endorphins, they're very familiar with endorphins. They get endorphins. So I go, okay, well look at the end of that, orphans. What does that remind you of? O-R-P-H-I-N. Exactly, right? That is morphine. And what is the prefix endo mean? Inside, right? So endorphins are your naturally occurring opiates, right? It's your endomorphine. That's what endorphins are, right? So, of course, people with substance use disorders really mess with that part of their brain, and it becomes problematic for them. But you know, they have to retrain that part of their brain. It takes a couple of years, unfortunately. But anyway, so endorphins, you know, we know that, right? Well, I had an endorphin rush. I don't know if any of you can really think of a time when that really happened to you. For some people, you know, it could be on, you know, like a roller coaster, or it could be, you know, when you had like an amazing conversation with somebody, or like the family was all together and everyone was in a good mood and you laughed a lot. You sort of had that sense of like, my heart is full, you know? I just have this like overwhelming sense of gratitude or connectedness, or, so endorphins are good for us. Why? Because, you know, they do, it does increase our blood flow, it does lower our blood pressure, it does block pain, which we were talking about just a couple minutes ago, increases our sense of physical stamina, reduces inflammation, all of those things. So we boost endorphins with laughter, with exercise, spicy food, dancing, but also acupuncture. There's definitely some research on that. Sex, of course, you know, it's there.
Enough said, right?
What?
I said enough said there.
Enough said, right? And music can actually also really create some endorphin rush. So there are ways that we can influence how our body feels and how our mind feels by some of these things, right? So some of them are, you know, some of the effects of what we talk about with these feel-good hormones are physical, like reduced blood pressure or better blood flow, and some of them are we feel good, right? So again, the mind-body connection shows up, right? Oh, these things happen both in our brains and in our bodies. So I'm going to end. I know we're at time. I have 3 minutes. I'm just going to end by giving you just some of this, because I do a whole hour-long presentation on something called Laugh for the Health of It. And so there's lots of stuff about laughter and health, but So yeah, so when we laugh, right, increases our oxygen in our bloodstream. Right? We take big deep breaths. The first medical people to really study the impact of laughter were actually pulmonologists. They were trying to find a more fun way. You know, after surgery, and you have to blow into that thing to keep your lungs clear so you don't get pneumonia. It's called a spirometer. So they wanted to find a more fun way to get people to keep their lungs clear. So they're the first ones to study laughter. So that's where they looked at this, right? It clears mucus, right? Laughter. Exercises your heart muscle. Increases circulation, increases IgA, IgM, and T cell production. So that's immunoglobulin A, immunoglobulin M. Those are immune boosting hormones, right? So remember, cortisol is immunosuppressive, right? Suppresses our immune system. We want to have some chemicals that actually increase our immune response, like IgA and IgM. That happens when we laugh. They've done fabulous studies on this, right? So IgA and IgM are present in your saliva. So they have these researchers who you spit in a cup, and then they had them go watch Richard Pryor movies, and then spit in a cup again. This is, swear to God, somebody gets paid for this. And they found that there was much more IgA and IgM in their saliva after they had a couple of hours of laughter. Now, it didn't last for forever, but it was the sense, right? You know, again, the others, we gotta fight with everything we got, right? Because the other stuff happens. And I tell people all the time, we don't have to practice feeling crappy. We do need to practice feeling good. Crappy will always come. So yeah, so then again, laughter decreases cortisol, the stress hormone, increases the relaxation response, and increases endorphins and all those kinds of things. So in summary, and again, like I said, I could talk for a whole hour about that, but you know, in summary, watch what you're thinking, because your body is listening. Right? Any questions, comments, thoughts? Please share.
Well, let's say thank you to Shara for that terrific